what is ballot harvesting or vote harvesting? I feel like we're hearing a lot about that in Texas recently.
Sure. So voter harvesting is a pretty straightforward idea, right? And so the idea here is, and once again, it's different across the country and whether states allow some version of it or not. But the idea is pretty straightforward. It's about people who actually are helping folks in the voting procedure. Maybe they have a disability, they can't read, they can't write, maybe they don't understand the language. A lot of times it's senior citizens, and so the idea is someone who's getting a ballot, a mail-in ballot, and someone needs help to kind of get it filled out and turned in. That's kind of what ballot harvesting is. The question is whether it's illegal or not, right? In some states you can do that, and there's limitations on who can do it. But the idea is pretty straightforward. It's about helping people who need some assistance in order to vote. And the idea in Texas, for example, that I think people that the law says you can't do is the idea of collecting a number of them or changing someone's vote, right? I mean, that's what you hear from the Attorney General's office, and a lot of folks, what they're worried about is that people are taking the assistance piece and going to actually casting the ballot or doing it for someone or convincing them to kind of do it a certain way, and moving way beyond assisting them to actually voting for them. And so that's where the illegality kind of comes into play in Texas.
And that's something that I don't think that would happen at an election office. So how do you go about proving ballot harvesting if those situations do arise?
And that's a great question, right? And so what we know is that there is very little evidence that this actually happens across the country. It's very rare. So this myth that it's happening in huge numbers and it's something that we really have to take on is not true. But how you actually figure out whether it's happening, each state once again does it a little bit different. So in Texas, for example, they may look to try to see if the signature on the ballot matches, say, what you did when you turned in your registration, right? Or another piece of information. They'll try to match someone's kind of signature to see if something seems off, right? You'll hear about sometimes people, maybe someone has a middle name and they actually use the middle name as how they really kind of write and put things down, but then it shows up with a first name or something. So they try to find discrepancies as a way to kind of, it's a hard thing to do, but those are some of the ways they do it. In addition to that, it's also about following the rules. So technically, in Texas, for example, you have to provide either some kind of a state driver's license or some kind of an ID or the last four digits of your social security number, and say maybe it's missing, because you have to do it both when you apply for the ballot itself, and then it's kind of strange, but it's actually on the inside flap of the envelope. Sometimes people may miss it or forget. It's kind of crazy. Sometimes they may miss it or forget to even do it. But if it's missing, that could send up, oh, wait, they forgot to do it. And technically, sometimes people will throw those out to kind of make the ballot bad. But those are when people are collecting them, that becomes part of it's not necessarily the harvesting portion, but it's kind of the very specific rules that need to kind of get filled out to see whether people are kind of following the law. And so it's tough to kind of find and prove. And once again, you'll see places like the Brennan Center who kind of study this, saying that there's a lot of time and resources that are kind of being wasted and kind of going after something that really isn't a problem across the country.
So in Texas and across the nation, we're seeing a lot of conversations about election integrity and ways to ensure that. Um, in Texas, why do you see this being such a big issue that state officials are looking at? And is it something generally that the public should be concerned about?
Yeah, so I think the second part of the question is no, the citizens shouldn't be worried because this is such a rare thing. And so the notion of kind of voter fraud, not just around ballot harvesting, but around non-citizens voting or other kinds of things, dead people voting, those kinds of things are so rare that it's not an issue. Now the vote is a really sacred thing, so you want to make sure that if anyone is breaking the law, that you're taking care of that. But the notion of focusing on it, or it's a huge, massive problem, is not true. And once again, it really depends on how you see the world, right? Even the language of election integrity. So in most red states, and you think about former President Donald Trump, will talk about even his campaign putting a lot of resources towards working on election integrity. That's for people who believe that there is a problem, that something's going on there and we need to kind of take it on. I don't care what the evidence tells me. I know someone's cheating and something's going on here. Think of the big lie of the 2020 election. But they believe that. They really kind of believe that we have to make sure that we do everything we can to kind of protect voting to happen in the way it should happen, right? But then you also have people who are the opposite, who are saying, wait, we need to make it easier for folks to be able to vote. Wow, this isn't a problem. It's such a rare thing. Why would you spend tons of resources? And for them, it's not even the language of election integrity. It's about really accessibility, right? And making it easier for folks to kind of vote. And depending on how you see the world, people will battle out across that spectrum as they see where resources should be placed and what we should be doing and what the focus should be on from offices like your state attorney general's office, for example.
We have a big election coming up in November. How do you foresee this conversation moving as we get closer and closer to that?
Yeah, I think, like I said, you're going to see both sides talking about their perspective on it, right? So you're going to continue to hear from the Trump campaign that not only just hearing them talking about it, but literally saying we're placing a priority on election integrity because we think they're going to try to steal the election, right? And so, and you're even over the last few days, you've started to see the RNC kind of actually put out statements saying that getting ready for this, right? Because something's going to be wrong here. And so, from the Republican side, you've got this notion of scaring people and having this fear that actually this idea actually is rampant and it's real, which it's not. The data shows us that it isn't. So you're going to hear that from the Republican side. On the Democratic side, you're going to hear about what can we do to kind of really make sure we're helping folks and getting folks to the polls. You'll see a huge difference, for example, in the presidential campaigns. We all know that it's 7 battleground states that are the most important states in the election that are up for grabs to get to that magic number of 270 electoral votes. You'll see right now on the Harris and the Walz side, 1,500, 1,600 staff members who've been hired across those 7 states, hundreds of offices, thousands of volunteers who are going to be going door to door and canvassing and knocking, doing everything they can to make sure people get to the polls. So you're going to be seeing from the Democratic side, this is not a problem, what's going on. We just have to make sure we get our voters to the polls. You're going to see on the Republican side, they don't have that same infrastructure. They're not kind of doing that kind of door-to-door canvassing at the same level as the Democrats, but huge emphasis is going to be about, hey, people are going to try to cheat. This isn't going to work. We need to make sure we have tons of lawyers ready to go. And you're going to see that difference of priority and the difference of kind of emphasis from the 2 different campaigns.
Is there anything else you think is important to mention as we continue to explore this idea as the Attorney General continues to bring these search warrants in cases?
Yeah, I think, for us as political scientists, for those who kind of look at these kinds of things, we know that the most important thing is evidence. And so the information to get out to the public of saying, things are safe. And at the same time, recognizing that when something happens, when there is someone who does break the law, they should be punished. But when we think about priorities, this kind of plays into that larger notion of where should we placing our resources and our limited dollars. I think the Houston Chronicle ran a piece last week that showed that the Attorney General's office has spent nearly $3.5 million over the past few years. And I think it closed 6 cases, right? So the return on investment of what's really important for a community and what's taking place. You think in Texas, we're number 1 in the country in the percentage of people who don't have health care, for example. And so it's about priorities. And so I think the important thing is, I think people want to hear making the case for the limited resources we have in our state governments. Where can it be best placed to help people with the most important issues? And I think the evidence shows us that this kind of emphasis on placing it on issues around voter fraud don't exist. It's not true. And so once again, I think those ongoing conversations, but once again, it all depends on how you see the world. That whole spectrum of whether you think of voting as being a privilege or a right, whether I'm going to make it easier for you to do it or whether I'm going to make it tougher for you to make sure you really want to do it well. That's kind of the bigger picture of how you see the world conversation that I think is going to continue in states like Texas.